When neighbors finally broke through the snowdrift that had buried Margaret Henshaw's door in late January of 1854, they found her alive, but barely conscious, inside a cabin that had become a tomb of accumulated cold and darkness, sitting in her chair beside a stove that had gone cold 3 days earlier, wrapped in every blanket and piece of clothing she owned, and positioned facing the door she had locked on the morning of January 12th when the snow had begun to fall. A door she had not opened again through 9 days of continuous snowfall that had buried her cabin to its roofline, that had sealed her inside as completely as if she had been interred, and that had transformed her decision to lock the door against the storm into a confinement so absolute that by the time neighbors reached her, she could no longer remember clearly why she had locked the door, or whether she had intended to lock herself inside for the duration, or whether she had simply been unable or unwilling to open it again once the snow had begun to pile against it, and once opening would have required confronting the reality of burial that locking had been meant to prevent. The neighbors carried her out through a tunnel they had dug through 6 feet of compacted snow, carried her to warmth and food and light, and listened to her fragmented account of 9 days spent alone in increasing cold and darkness, while snow fell outside in quantities that seemed impossible, while drifts rose higher than windows, and then higher than doors, and then higher than the walls themselves. And while she sat inside, maintaining the pretense of normalcy through routines that became progressively more difficult to perform until finally the routines stopped, and she simply sat in her chair waiting for either rescue or death, unable to determine which would come first and unable to take any action that might influence the outcome. Welcome to this journey through one of the most extended episodes of snow-induced confinement ever documented in the Ozark Plateau. In the years when winter storms could last for days and when snow accumulation could bury structures completely, creating conditions where people trapped inside had to wait for external rescue, because digging out from inside was impossible once snow had compacted against doors and windows. When the decision to lock a door at the beginning of a storm could mean remaining locked inside for the duration, regardless of how long that duration extended. When 9 days of continuous snowfall was rare enough to be unprecedented, but not so rare that it could not occur without warning and without mercy. For those caught unprepared, there lived a widow who locked her door when snow began, and who remained locked inside through more than a week of accumulation that buried her cabin, and that demonstrated the difference between choosing confinement and having confinement chosen for you by weather that will not stop, and by snow that will not cease falling until it has buried everything that stands above ground level. Leave a comment where you're watching from as we trace the line between shelter and entombment, between staying inside by choice and staying inside because leaving has become physically impossible. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Before we enter that cabin and watch 9 days accumulate into burial, consider what extended snowfall meant on the frontier and why experienced survivors understood that locking doors at the beginning of storms was dangerous, because locks that could be opened from inside at the start of a storm might not be openable from inside after days of accumulation had piled snow against the door in quantities that made the door immovable from within. Frontier doors opened outward, a design that made entry easier, but that also meant snow piling against the outside of the door created resistance that increased with every inch of accumulation, creating situations where, after sufficient snow had fallen, the door could not be pushed open from inside because the weight and compaction of snow against it exceeded human strength to overcome. The solution was to keep doors unlatched during storms, to allow the possibility of pushing the door open periodically to clear snow before it accumulated to problematic levels, to maintain access to the outside that would allow escape if escape became necessary. Locking the door, securing it with an internal bar or latch that prevented it from being pushed open, meant committing to remaining inside for the duration of the storm, regardless of how long the storm lasted or how much snow accumulated. Because once locked, the door could not be opened from outside by rescuers and could not be pushed open from inside against accumulated snow, creating situations where the person inside was sealed as completely as if the door had been nailed shut. Most people understood this and kept doors unlatched during storms. But some people, those who feared the storm more than they feared confinement, those who believed that securing the door would somehow increase safety against weather that could not actually enter through an unlatched door, chose to lock their doors when storms began, choosing the psychological comfort of a secured barrier over the practical necessity of maintaining the ability to leave if conditions required it. These people gambled that storms would be brief, that accumulation would be manageable, and that the decision to lock the door could be reversed by simply unlatching and pushing out if circumstances changed. But 9 days of continuous snowfall changed circumstances in ways that made reversal impossible, made locked doors into sealed tombs, and made the decision to lock against the storm into the mechanism that ensured the storm would bury you completely while you sat inside unable to escape. Margaret Henshaw was 49 years old in the winter of 1853 to 1854, widowed for 7 years following the death of her husband, Thomas, from pneumonia in 1846. She lived alone in a cabin approximately 6 miles south of what would eventually become West Plains, Missouri, on property that she and Thomas had claimed in 1841 and that she had continued to maintain alone following his death. Margaret was known to neighbors as a competent woman who managed her property adequately and who had survived 7 winters alone without unusual difficulty, though neighbors also noted that she had become increasingly anxious about winter weather in recent years, had expressed fears about being trapped by snow, and had taken precautions that seemed excessive, stockpiling food and firewood in quantities that exceeded what one person could reasonably need, reinforcing her cabin against drafts and cold in ways that made it more sealed than most frontier cabins, and developing routines around storm preparation that suggested she viewed winter weather as a threat requiring defensive measures, rather than as a seasonal reality to be managed through normal caution. The winter of 1853 to 1854 had been typical through December and early January, cold but not exceptional, with snow that fell and melted in normal patterns, creating conditions that required attention, but not extraordinary measures. Margaret had prepared adequately, had gathered firewood and supplies, and had settled into her winter routines without apparent difficulty. Neighbors who saw her in early January reported that she seemed well, seemed to be managing the winter competently, and showed no signs of distress or unusual anxiety beyond her general tendency toward excessive preparation. On the morning of January 12th, 1854, Margaret looked out her cabin window and saw that snow had begun to fall. Not heavy snow at first, but steady snow of the kind that sometimes continued for hours or for a full day, creating accumulation that required management, but that was not immediately threatening. This was normal winter weather, the kind that frontier residents expected and handled routinely. But something in the quality of the snow or in the quality of Margaret's state of mind that morning caused her to make a decision that would transform normal winter weather into a crisis that nearly killed her. She locked her door. She drew the wooden bar across it, securing it from the inside, preventing it from being opened either from inside by pushing or from outside by lifting the latch. She locked it, she would later say, because the snow looked like it would be heavy, because she wanted to keep the cold out, because securing the door made her feel safer against the storm. The reasoning reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how doors and snow and safety worked. The door being unlatched did not let cold in any more than the door being latched kept cold out, and securing the door did not provide any protection against weather that cold and snow already provided simply by being a barrier between inside and outside. But Margaret locked it anyway, choosing the feeling of security over the reality of maintaining escape options, choosing to seal herself inside at the moment when the storm began, and the storm continued. Through January 12th, the snow fell steadily, accumulating at perhaps an inch per hour, creating depths that grew throughout the day. Margaret maintained her routines inside the cabin, keeping fire, preparing food, occupying herself with the small tasks that cabin life allowed. She could see through her window that snow was accumulating outside, could see that depths were becoming substantial, but from inside the warm cabin with the locked door the snow seemed manageable, seemed like weather that would stop eventually, and that would be dealt with once it stopped. But January 13th brought not the end of snow, but the continuation of it. Through the second day, the snow continued to fall at rates that matched the first day, adding inches upon inches to accumulation that was already measured in feet. Margaret began to feel concern. This was more snow than was typical, was accumulation that was becoming exceptional. But she was inside, was warm, had supplies, and the locked door meant she was committed to staying inside regardless of conditions outside. So concern did not translate into action, because no action was available beyond continuing to wait for the snow to stop. January 14th, the third day, brought still more snow. The accumulation outside Margaret's window was now several feet deep and still growing, and Margaret could see that drifts were beginning to form against her cabin walls. That snow was piling up in ways that suggested the cabin itself was creating barriers that caused snow to accumulate faster against the structure than it accumulated in open areas. The window was becoming partially obscured by snow that had drifted up the exterior wall, and the light entering the cabin was beginning to diminish as snow blocked more and more of the glass. Through January 15th, 16th, and 17th, days 4, 5, and 6 of continuous snowfall, the situation inside the cabin began to deteriorate in ways that Margaret had not anticipated when she locked the door on the morning of the 12th. The windows were now almost completely covered by snow drifted against the exterior walls, allowing only minimal light to enter even during what should have been midday brightness. The cabin was becoming dark despite the oil lamp Margaret kept burning, was becoming cold despite the fire she maintained in the stove, and was becoming oppressive in ways that had nothing to do with temperature or light, but that had everything to do with the knowledge that she was being buried, that snow was rising up the walls outside, and that the locked door that had seemed like security on January 12th now felt like the mechanism of her imprisonment. Margaret's firewood supply, which had seemed abundant when the storm began, was depleting faster than she had calculated it would, because the cold that penetrated the increasingly buried cabin required more fire to counteract. Her food supplies remained adequate, but her psychological state was beginning to show signs of the strain that extended isolation and increasing darkness and the awareness of burial created. She found herself sitting for long periods doing nothing, staring at the door she had locked, wondering whether she should try to open it, wondering whether opening it was even possible given the snow that must be piled against it, wondering whether attempting to open it would achieve anything beyond confirming that she was truly sealed inside, with no way out until the snow stopped, and until someone came to dig her out. By January 18th, day 7, the cabin was buried to the point where almost no natural light entered through the snow-covered windows. Margaret was living in near constant lamplight, was burning through her oil supply to maintain even minimal visibility, was existing in a darkness that felt complete, except for the small circle of light the lamp provided. The fire in the stove was her only source of heat, and maintaining that fire was becoming the central focus of her existence. Gathering wood from the diminishing pile, feeding the stove, watching the flames, and dreading the moment when the wood would run out and when cold would enter the cabin in ways that fire had been preventing. She tried the door on the evening of January 18th. She lifted the bar, unlatching it, and pushed against the door with all her strength. The door did not move. It did not budge, even slightly. The snow piled against it from outside, snow that had accumulated for 7 days, that had compacted under its own weight, that had drifted and compressed against the door until it formed a barrier that no amount of pushing from inside could overcome, held the door closed as firmly as if it had been nailed shut. Margaret pushed again, threw her weight against it, strained until exhaustion, and achieved nothing. The door that she had locked on January 12th could not be opened on January 18th, and the lock she had drawn across it was now irrelevant because the snow had created a more effective lock than any wooden bar could create. She was sealed inside. The locked door had become unnecessary because the snow had done the locking for her. She was in a tomb that she had helped create by locking the door at the beginning, by sealing herself inside voluntarily at the moment when she could have remained unsealed, and now she was sealed involuntarily by snow that would not allow escape even if she wanted to escape, and even if she had left the door unlatched from the beginning. January 19th and 20th, days 8 and 9, brought the final accumulation. The snow continued to fall through these days, adding final feet to depths that were already measured in multiple feet, burying the cabin completely so that only the roof remained above the surface of the snow, so that the cabin had effectively become a chamber beneath the snow, rather than a structure standing above it. Margaret's lamp oil was nearly exhausted, her firewood was critically low, and her psychological state had deteriorated to the point where she was no longer maintaining routines, but was simply sitting in her chair, wrapped in every blanket she owned, staring at nothing, waiting for the snow to stop, or for death to arrive or for rescue to occur, unable to determine which was most likely and unable to influence any of them. On the evening of January 20th, her firewood ran out. She burned the last pieces, watched the fire die down to coals and then to ashes, and felt the cold begin to enter the cabin in earnest. Without fire, the temperature inside began to drop toward the temperature outside, began to approach levels where survival without heat source was measured in hours rather than days, began to create the final crisis where Margaret would either be rescued soon or would freeze in her chair waiting for rescue that came too late. She wrapped herself in every piece of fabric available, blankets, clothing, anything that could provide insulation against cold that was now unchallenged by fire. She sat in her chair facing the door that she had locked 9 days earlier, the door that she could not open now even though the lock was off, the door that represented both her imprisonment and her only hope for rescue, because rescue would have to come through that door or would not come at all. On the morning of January 21st, the day after the snow finally stopped, Robert and Catherine Walsh began the difficult work of checking on their isolated neighbors. The Walshes lived approximately 2 miles from Margaret Henshaw's cabin, and they had spent the 9-day storm confined to their own cabin, watching snow accumulate to levels neither of them had seen in 15 years of living in the region. When the snow finally stopped on the evening of January 20th, Robert knew that checking on neighbors would be essential, because 9 days of such heavy snow meant that people living alone or in isolated locations might be in crisis, buried, running out of supplies, trapped inside structures that snow had sealed. The journey to Margaret's cabin took most of the morning despite the 2-mile distance. Robert had to break trail through snow that was hip-deep in areas that had not, drifted, and that was overhead deep in areas where drifts had formed. He carried a shovel, knowing that digging would likely be required, and he carried food and water, knowing that anyone who had been trapped for 9 days might need immediate sustenance. When he finally reached the area where Margaret's cabin should be, he initially could not locate it. The snow had buried it so completely that only the peak of the roof was visible above the surrounding snow level, and even that peak was barely distinguishable from the general undulating surface that the drifted snow had created. Robert had to use landmarks, trees, fence posts, his memory of where the cabin had stood, to determine where to begin digging, and even then he had to dig several exploratory holes before he found the cabin's wall buried beneath 6 feet of compacted snow. He began digging in earnest, creating a trench that descended from the surface level of the snow down toward where he estimated the door would be located. The work was exhausting. The snow had compacted under its own weight and under the wind that had blown during the 9 days of falling, creating density that made each shovelful heavy and that made progress slow. He dug for more than an hour before he reached the level where the door should be, before he cleared enough snow to expose the wooden surface, before he could call out to see if Margaret was inside, and if she was still alive. He called her name, shouted through the door, listened for any response. For long moments he heard nothing, and he feared that he had arrived too late, that 9 days of burial had been too long, that Margaret had frozen or suffocated or had died from any of the causes that could kill someone trapped alone in darkness and cold. But then he heard something, a faint sound, something that might have been a voice or might have been movement, something that suggested presence, if not necessarily consciousness or coherence. Robert tried the door and found it would not open. He assumed snow was still blocking it from outside despite his digging, so he dug more, cleared more snow, created more space. But the door still would not open, still would not move. He realized that the door must be latched from inside, that Margaret had locked it, and that she was either unable or unwilling to unlatch it now. He called to her again, told her to unlatch the door, told her to open it so he could help her. He heard sounds from inside that might have been attempts to respond, but the door remained closed, remained locked, and Robert understood that Margaret was either too weak to lift the latch or too disoriented to understand what he was asking her to do. He had to break the door. Using the shovel as a lever and using his weight against the wood, he forced the door frame, splintering the wood around the latch until the lock gave way and the door could be pulled open. Cold air rushed out of the cabin, cold, but not as cold as outside, suggesting that some residual warmth remained despite the dead fire. And in the dim light that entered through the opened door, Robert saw Margaret sitting in her chair wrapped in blankets, staring at the door with eyes that seemed to see him, but that also seemed to be seeing something else, or nothing at all. Eyes that suggested consciousness but not full awareness. Eyes that reflected 9 days of darkness and cold and isolation that had pushed her to the edge of whatever edge human beings reach when left alone too long in conditions that should not be survived. Robert spoke to her, told her he was there to help, told her she was safe now. Margaret responded, but her words were fragmented, were disconnected from each other and from the situation, were the words of someone who had spent too long alone in darkness, talking to herself or to no one, and who had difficulty now transitioning back to talking to another person who was actually present. She talked about the snow, about how it would not stop, about how she had locked the door to keep safe, but the door had trapped her. about how she had tried to open it, but it would not open, about how cold it had become when the fire went out, about how she had been waiting for someone to come, or for death to come, and she had not been sure which she wanted to arrive first. Robert wrapped additional blankets around her, gave her small amounts of water, not too much because people in her condition could not handle large quantities immediately, and then began the process of getting her out of the cabin and through the tunnel he had dug and back to his cabin where Catherine could provide care and warmth and food. Margaret was weak, was barely able to walk even with support, and the journey back through the snow took hours. But by late afternoon, Robert had gotten her to his cabin, had gotten her warm and fed, and had begun the process of helping her recover from 9 days of entombment that had nearly killed her. Over the following days, as Margaret slowly regained strength and as her mental state gradually stabilized, she told Robert and Catherine about the 9 days she had spent inside the buried cabin. She described locking the door on the morning of January 12th when the snow began, thinking it would keep her safe. She described watching through the window as snow accumulated through days 1 and 2 and 3, watching as the window became obscured, watching as darkness increased. She described the deterioration of conditions through days 4, 5, and 6, the cold penetrating despite fire, the darkness despite lamps, the growing awareness that she was being buried and could not stop it. She described trying the door on day 7, discovering it would not open, understanding that she was sealed inside. She described the final days, 8 and 9, as the firewood ran out, as the lamp oil depleted, as cold entered and darkness became nearly complete. She described sitting in her chair on day 9 after the fire died, wrapped in blankets, too weak or too resigned to do anything but wait, believing that no one would come in time, believing that she would freeze in her chair, and being unable to care very much because caring required energy she no longer had. She described hearing Robert's voice calling through the door on the morning of day 10, hearing it as if from very far away, trying to respond but finding that making her voice work required effort. She could barely manage, trying to stand to unlatch the door but finding that her legs would not support her weight, and then hearing the door being broken open and seeing light enter, and seeing Robert's form silhouetted against the brightness that seemed impossible after so many days of darkness. Margaret recovered physically over several weeks. The damage from cold and from inadequate food and from the psychological stress of 9 days alone in increasing darkness was significant, but not permanent. She regained her strength, regained her health, and eventually was able to return to independent living, though she never returned to the cabin where she had been buried. That cabin, once excavated fully from the snow that had buried it, showed evidence of the 9 days Margaret had spent inside. The cold stove filled with ash, the empty lamp with its depleted oil, the pile of blankets in the chair where she had sat waiting, and the door with the broken latch where Robert had forced entry. The cabin was eventually reclaimed by another resident, but the story of Margaret Henshaw and the 9 days of snow became part of the region's collective memory, a reminder of what extended snowfall could do, of how burial could occur, and of how the decision to lock a door at the beginning of a storm could transform into imprisonment that lasted until the storm ended, or until rescue arrived, or until cold claimed those who had sealed themselves inside. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the Ozark Plateau's most extended episodes of snow-induced confinement. A widow who locked her door when snow began and who remained locked inside through 9 days of continuous snowfall that buried her cabin, and that demonstrated how shelter becomes tomb when snow will not stop falling and when locked doors cannot be opened even after locks are lifted. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory where storms last 9 days and where locked doors become sealed tombs. Consider subscribing to Commutales for more stories that explore the boundaries between shelter and entombment. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Margaret's decision to lock the door. And if this story resonated with you, a like helps bring these narratives to more people. Until our next journey, remember that somewhere in the Ozark Plateau, a woman once locked her door when snow began to fall. And the snow fell for 9 days, burying her cabin, sealing her inside, until neighbors dug through 6 feet of accumulation to reach a door that would not open from inside, and a woman who had spent more than a week in darkness waiting for rescue or death